The Mamluk Sultanate was a medieval realm spanning Egypt, the Levant and Hejaz that established itself as a caliphate. It lasted from the overthrow of the Ayyubid dynasty until the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517. Historians have traditionally broken the era of Mamluk rule into two periods, one covering 1250 to 1382 and the other 1382 to 1517. Western historians call the former the Bahri period and the latter the Burji because of the political dominance of the regimes known by those names during the respective eras. Modern sources also refer to the same divisions as the Turkish and Circassian periods to stress the change in the ethnic origins of most Mamluks. The term Mamluk Sultanate is a modern historiographical term. The Sultanate's ruling caste was composed of Mamluks, soldiers predominantly of Cuman Kipchaks, Circassian, Abkhazian, Oghuz Turks and Georgian slave origin. While Mamluks were purchased, their status was above that of ordinary slaves, who were not allowed to carry weapons or perform certain tasks. Mamluks were considered to be true lords, with social status above citizens of Egypt. Though it declined towards the end of its existence, at its height the Sultanate represented the zenith of medieval Egyptian and Levantine political, economic, and cultural glory in the Islamic Golden Age. History. Origins. The Mamluk was an owned slave, distinguished from the Ghulam, or household slave. After thorough training in various fields such as martial arts, court etiquette and Islamic sciences, these slaves were freed. However, they were still expected to remain loyal to their master and serve his household. Mamluks had formed a part of the state or military apparatus in Syria and Egypt since at least the 9th century, rising to become governing dynasties of Egypt and the Levant during the Tulunid and Iqshidid periods. Mamluk regiments constituted the backbone of Egypt's military under Ayyubid rule in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, beginning with Sultan Saladin, who replaced the Fatimids' black African infantry with Mamluks. Each Ayyubid sultan and high-ranking emir had a private Mamluk corps. Most of the Mamluks in the Ayyubid service were ethnic Kipchak Turks from Central Asia, who, upon entering service, were converted to Sunni Islam and taught Arabic. A Mamluk was highly committed to his master, to whom he often referred as father, and was in turn treated more as a kinsman than as a slave. Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, the last of the Ayyubid sultans, had acquired some 1000 Mamluks from Syria, Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula by 1229, while serving as Naib of Egypt during the absence of his father, Sultan al-Kamil. These Mamluks were called the Salihiyya after their master, as Salih became Sultan of Egypt in 1240, and, upon his accession to the Ayyubid throne, he manumitted and promoted large numbers of his original and newly recruited Mamluks on the condition that they remain in his service. To provision his Mamluks, as-Salih forcibly seized the iqdad of his predecessors' emirs. As-Salih sought to create a paramilitary apparatus in Egypt loyal to himself, and his aggressive recruitment and promotion of Mamluks led contemporaries to view Egypt as Salihi-ridden, according to historian Winslow William Clifford. Despite his close relationship with his Mamluks, tensions existed between as-Salih and the Salihiyya, and a number of Salihi Mamluks were imprisoned or exiled throughout as-Salih's reign. While historian Stephen Humphreys asserts that the Salihiyya's increasing dominance of the state did not personally threaten as-Salih due to their fidelity to him, Clifford believes that the Salihiyya developed an autonomy within the state that fell short of such loyalty. Opposition among the Salihiyya to as-Salih rose when the latter ordered the assassination of his brother Abu Bakr al-Adil in 1249, a task that affronted many of the Salihiyya and by whom was rejected. 4 of the Salihiyya ultimately agreed to execute the controversial operation. Rise to power. Conflict with the Ayyubids. Tensions between as-Salih Najm al-Din Ayyub and his Mamluks came to a head later in 1249 when Louis IX of France's forces captured Damietta in their bid to conquer Egypt during the Seventh Crusade. As-Salih believed Damietta should not have been evacuated and was rumored to have threatened punitive action against the Damietta garrison. The rumor, accentuated by the execution of civilian notables who evacuated Damietta, provoked a mutiny by the garrison of his camp in al-Mansurah, which included numerous Salihi Mamluks. The situation was calmed after the intervention of the Atabeg al-Askar, Fakhr ad-Din ibn Sheikh al-Shuyuk. As the Crusaders advanced, as-Salih died and was succeeded by his son al-Muazzam Turan Shah, who was in al-Jazira at the time. Initially, the Salihiyya welcomed Turan Shah's succession, with many greeting him and requesting confirmation of their administrative posts and iqta assignments at his arrival to the Egyptian frontier. However, Turan Shah sought to challenge the dominance of the Salihiyya in the paramilitary apparatus by promoting his Kurdish retinue from Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant as a counterweight to the predominantly Turkic Salihiyya. Prior to Turan Shah's arrival at the front facing the French, the Bariya, a junior regiment of the Salihiyya commanded by Baybars al-Budukdari, defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of al-Mansura on February 11, 1250. On 27 February, Turan Shah, as new sultan, arrived in Egypt from Hasankeyf, where he had been emir of Hisn Kaifa since 636, and went straight to al-Mansura to lead the Egyptian army. On April 5, 1250, covered by the darkness of night, the Crusaders evacuated their camp opposite al-Mansura and began to flee northward towards Damietta. The Egyptians followed them into the Battle of Fariskar, where the Egyptians utterly destroyed the Crusaders on 6 April. King Louis IX and a few of his surviving nobles surrendered and were taken as prisoners, effectively ending the Seventh Crusade. Turan Shah proceeded to place his own entourage and Mamluks, known as the Muazzamiya, in positions of authority to the detriment of Salihi interests. On May 2, 1250, a group of disgruntled Salihi officers had Turan Shah assassinated at his camp in Fariskar. According to Humphreys, as Salih's frequent wars against his Ayyubid relatives likely voided the Salihiyya's loyalty to other members of the Ayyubid dynasty. Nonetheless, the Salihiyya were careful not to depict the assassination of Turan Shah as an assault against Ayyubid legitimacy, but rather an act against a deviant of the Muslim polity. Moreover, an electoral college dominated by the Salihiyya convened to choose a successor to Turan Shah among the Ayyubid emirs, with opinion largely split between an-Nasir Yusuf of Damascus and al-Mughith Umar of al-Karak. Ultimately, however, consensus settled on as-Salih's widow, Shajar ad-Dur. Shajar ad-Dur ensured the Salihiyya's dominance of the paramilitary elite, and ushered in a process of establishing patronage and kinship ties with the Salihiyya. In particular, she cultivated close ties with the Jamdari and Bari elements of the Salihiyya, by distributing to them ikta and other benefits. The Bariya were named after the Arabic word bar, meaning sea or large river, because their barracks was located on the Nile River island of Rada. They were mostly drawn from among the Cumans Kipchaks who controlled the steppes north of the Black Sea. Shajar al-Dur's efforts and the lingering desire among the military in Egypt to maintain the Ayyubid state was made evident when the Salihi Mamluk and Atabeg al-Askar, Aybak, attempted to claim the sultanate, but was prevented from monopolizing power by the army and the Babariya and Jamdariya, which asserted that only an Ayyubid could exercise sultanic authority. The Bariya compelled Aybak to share power with al-Ashraf Musa, a grandson of Sultan al-Kamil. Factional power struggles. Aybak was one of the oldest of the Salihi Mamluks and a senior member of as-Salih's inner circle, despite only being an emir Awsat. He served as the principal bulwark against the more junior Bari and Jamdari elements of the Salihiyya, and his promotion to Atabeg al-Askar was met by Bari rioting in Cairo, the first of many examples of intra-Salihi tensions surrounding Aybak's ascendancy. The Bariya and Jamdariya were represented by their patron, Faris ad-Din Aktay, a principal organizer of Turan Shah's assassination and the recipient of Fakhr ad-Din's large estate by Shajar al-Dur. The latter saw Aktay as a counterweight to Aybak. Aybak moved against the Bariya in 1251 by shutting down their Rada headquarters in a bid to sap Aktay's power base. Aybak was still unable to promote his own Mamluks, known as the Moisiya, to senior posts until 1252. That year, he managed to dispatch Aktay to Upper Egypt to suppress an Arab uprising. Instead of isolating Aktay as was Aybak's intention, the assignment allowed Aktay to impose extortionate taxes in Upper Egypt and provide him the personal funds to finance his patronage of the Bariya. In 1254, Aybak had his Moisi Mamluks assassinate Aktay in the citadel of Cairo. Afterward, Aybak proceeded to purge those in his retinue and in the Salihiyya whom he believed were disloyal to him, causing a temporary exodus of Bari Mamluks, most of whom settled in Gaza, but also in Upper Egypt and Syria. The purge led to a dearth of military support for Aybak, which in turn led to Aybak's recruitment of new supporters from among the army in Egypt and the Turkic Nasiri and Azizi Mamluks from Syria, who had defected from their Ayyubid masters, namely an-Nasir Yusuf, and moved to Egypt in 1250. The Syrian Mamluks were led by their patron Jamal ad-Din Adupti and were assigned most of the ikta of Aktay and his allies. However, Adupti's growing ambitions made Aybak view him as a threat. After Aybak learned that Aydupti was plotting to topple him and recognize Nasir Yusuf as Ayyubid Sultan, which would likely leave Aydupti in virtual control of Egypt, Aybak had Aydupti imprisoned in Alexandria in 1254 or 1255. Meanwhile, the Bahriya faction in Gaza commanded by Baibars sought to enlist their services with Nasir Yusuf. In an attempt to dislodge Aybak, the Bahriya petitioned Nasir Yusuf to claim the Ayyubid throne and invade Egypt, but Nasir Yusuf initially refused. However, in 1256, he dispatched a Bahri-led expedition to Egypt, but no battle occurred when Aybak met Nasir Yusuf's army. Aybak was assassinated on April 10, 1257, possibly on the orders of Shujar al-Dur, who was assassinated a week later. Their deaths left a relative power vacuum in Egypt, with Aybak's teenage son, Al-Mansur Ali, as heir to the Sultanate. While Al-Mansur Ali was Sultan, the strongman in Egypt was Aybak's former close aide, Saif ad-Din Qutuz, who also had hostile relations with the Salihiyya, including the Bahri Mamluks. By the time of Aybak's death, the Bahriya had entered the service of al-Mughith Umar of al-Karak, who agreed to invade Egypt and claim the Ayyubid Sultanate, but al-Mughith's small Bahri-dominated invading force was routed at the frontier with Egypt in November. The Bahriya and al-Mughith launched a second expedition in 1258, but were again defeated. The Bahriya subsequently raided areas around Syria, threatening Nasir Yusuf's power in Damascus. After a first attempt to defeat the Bahriya near Gaza failed, and Nasir Yusuf launched a second expedition against them with Al-Mansur Muhammad II of Hama, resulting in a Bahriya defeat at Jericho. And Nasir Yusuf proceeded to besiege al-Mughith and the Bahriya at al-Karak, but the growing threat of a Mongol invasion of Syria ultimately led to a reconciliation between Nasir Yusuf and al-Mughith, and Baibars's defection to the former. Qutuz deposed Al-Mansur Ali in 1259. Afterward, he purged and/or arrested the Moisiyah and any Bahri Mamluks he could locate in Egypt in a bid to eliminate dissent towards his rule. The surviving Moisi and Bahri Mamluks made their way to Gaza, where Baibars had created a virtual shadow state in opposition to Qutuz. While various Mamluk factions competed for control of Egypt and Syria, the Mongols under the command of Hulagu Khan had sacked Baghdad, the intellectual and spiritual center of the Islamic world, in 1258, and proceeded westward, capturing Aleppo and Damascus. Qutuz sent military reinforcements to his erstwhile enemy Nasir Yusuf in Syria, and reconciled with the Bahriya, including Baibars, who was allowed to return to Egypt, to face the common Mongol threat. Hulagu sent emissaries to Qutuz in Cairo, demanding submission to Mongol rule. Qutuz had the emissaries killed, an act which historian Joseph Cummins called the worst possible insult to the Mongol throne. Qutuz then prepared Cairo's defenses to ward off the Mongols' threatened invasion of Egypt, but after hearing news that Hulagu withdrew from Syria to claim the Mongol throne, Qutuz began preparations for the conquest of Syria. He mobilized a force of some 120,000 soldiers and gained the support of his main Mamluk rival, Baibars. The Mamluks entered Palestine to confront the Mongol army that Hulagu left behind under the command of Kitbuqa. In September 1260, the two sides met in the plain south of Nazareth in a major confrontation known as the Battle of Ain Jalut. Qutuz had some of his cavalry units hide in the hills around Ain Jalut, while directing Baibars's forces to advance past Ain Jalut against Kitbuqa's Mongols. In the ensuing half-hour clash, Baibars's men feigned a retreat and were pursued by Kitbuqa. The latter's forces fell into a Mamluk trap once they reached the springs of Ain Jalut, with Baibars's men turning around to confront the Mongols and Qutuz's units ambushing the Mongols from the hills. The battle ended in a Mongol rout and Kitbuqa's capture and execution. Afterward, the Mamluks proceeded to recapture Damascus and the other Syrian cities taken by the Mongols. Upon Qutuz's triumphant return to Cairo, he was assassinated in a Bahri plot. Baibars subsequently assumed power in Egypt in late 1260, and established the Bahri Mamluk Sultanate. Bahri rule. Reign of Baibars. Baibars rebuilt the Bahriya's former headquarters in Rabba Island and put Qalawun, one of his most senior associates, in command of it. In 1263, Baibars deposed al-Mughith of al-Karak based on allegations of collaborating with the Mongol Ilkhanate of Persia, and thus consolidated his authority over Muslim Syria. During his early reign and through heavy financial expense, Baibars rebuilt and stringently trained the Mamluk army, which grew from 10,000 cavalry to 40,000, with a 4,000-strong royal guard at its core. The new force was rigidly disciplined and highly trained in horsemanship, swordsmanship and archery. Another major component to Baybar's rule was intrastate communication. To accomplish this, he instituted a postal network that extended across the cities of Egypt and Syria. The need for smooth delivery of correspondence also led to the large-scale repair or construction of roads and bridges along the postal route. Baybars attempted to institute dynastic rule by assigning his 4-year-old son Al-Sa'id Baraka as co-sultan, thereby ending the Mamluk tradition of electing a leader, but this effort was ultimately unsuccessful, at least for his Ziyarat household. Successful rulership became highly dependent on Baybar's personal qualities. However, Baybar's success in establishing centralized rule resulted in the consolidation of the Mamluk Sultanate. Through opening diplomatic channels with the Mongols, Baybars also sought to stifle a potential alliance between the Mongols and the Christian powers of Europe, while also sowing divisions between the Mongol Ilkhanate and the Mongol Golden Horde. In addition, his diplomacy was also intended to maintain the flow of Turkic Mamluks from Mongol-held Central Asia, with Bahri power in Egypt and Muslim Syria consolidated by 1265. Baybars launched expeditions against the Crusader fortresses throughout Syria, capturing Arsuf in 1265, and Halba and Arka in 1266. According to historian Thomas Asbridge, the methods used to capture Arsuf demonstrated the Mamluks' grasp of siegecraft and their overwhelming numerical and technological supremacy. Baybar's strategy regarding the Crusader fortresses along the Syrian coast was not to capture and utilize the fortresses, but to destroy them and thus prevent their potential future use by new waves of Crusaders. In August 1266, the Mamluks launched a punitive expedition against the Armenian Cilician kingdom for its alliance with the Mongols, laying waste to numerous Armenian villages and significantly weakening the kingdom. At around the same time, Baybar's forces captured Safad from the Knights Templar, and shortly after, Ramla, both cities in interior Palestine. Unlike the coastal Crusader fortresses, the Mamluks strengthened and utilized the interior cities as major garrisons and administrative centers. Campaigns against the Crusaders continued in 1267, and in the spring of 1268, Baybar's forces captured Jaffa before conquering the major Crusader fortress of Antioch on 18 May. Baybars initiated a more aggressive policy than his predecessors toward the Christian Nubian kingdom of Makuria on Egypt's southern border. In 1265, the Mamluks launched an invasion of northern Makuria, and forced the Nubian king to become a vassal of the Mamluks. Around that time, the Mamluks had conquered the Red Sea areas of Suakin and the Nadalik archipelago, while attempting to extend their control to the Hejaz, the desert regions west of the Nile, and Barca. In 1268, the Makurian king, David I, overthrew the Mamluks' vassal and in 1272, raided the Mamluk Red Sea port of Adab. Meanwhile, Louis IX of France launched the Eighth Crusade, this time targeting Tunis with the intention of ultimately invading Egypt. However, Louis IX died, allowing the Mamluks to refocus their efforts at further conquests of Crusader territories in Syria, including the county of Tripoli's Croix des Chevaliers fortress, which Baybars captured in 1271. Despite an alliance with the Assassins in 1272, in July 1273, the Mamluks, who by then determined that the Assassins' independence was problematic, wrested control of the Assassins' fortresses in Jabal Ansariya, including Misyaf. In 1275, the Mamluk governor of Kous, with Bedouin allies, launched an expedition against Makuria, defeating King David near Dongola in 1276, and installed Sheikanda as king. This brought the fortress of Qasr Ibrim under Mamluk jurisdiction. The conquest of Nubia was not permanent, however, and the process of invading the region and installing a vassal king would be repeated by Baybar's successors. Nonetheless, Baybar's initial conquest led the annual expectation of tribute from the Nubians by the Mamluks until the Makurian kingdom's demise in the mid-14th century. Furthermore, the Mamluks also received the submission of King Ajar of Al-Abwab further south. In 1277, Baybars launched an expedition against the Ilkhanids, routing them in Elbistan in Anatolia, before ultimately withdrawing to avoid overstretching their forces and risk being cut off from Syria by a second, large incoming Ilkhanid army. Early Qalayuni period. In July 1277, Baybars died en route to Damascus, and was succeeded by Baraka. However, the latter's ineptness precipitated a power struggle that ended with Qalan being elected sultan in November 1279. The Ilkhanids took advantage of the disarray of Babur's succession by raiding Mamluk Syria, before launching a massive offensive against Syria in the autumn of 1281. Khalan's forces were significantly outnumbered by the estimated 80,000-strong Ilkhanid Armenian-Georgian Seljuk coalition, but marched north from Damascus to meet the Ilkhanid army at Homs. In the 28th of October Battle of Homs, the Mamluks routed the Ilkhanids and confirmed Mamluk dominance in Syria. The defeat of the Ilkhanids allowed Khalan to proceed and eliminate the remaining Crusader outposts in Syria. In May 1285, he captured the Markab fortress and garrisoned it. Khalan's early reign was marked by policies that were meant to gain the support of important societal elements, namely the merchant class, the Muslim bureaucracy and the religious establishment. Among these early policies were the elimination of illegal taxes that burdened the merchant community and extensive building and renovation projects for Islam's holiest sites, such as the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. Following the détente with the Ilkhanate after 1280, Khalan launched a wide arrest campaign to eliminate internal dissent, imprisoning dozens of high-ranking emirs in Egypt and Syria. The détente also saw a shift in Khalan's building activities to focus on more secular and personal purposes, including a large, multi-division hospital complex in Cairo across from the tomb of As-Salih Ayyub. Construction of the hospital, a contrast from his Mamluk predecessors who focused on establishing madrasas, was done to gain the goodwill of the public, create a lasting legacy, and secure his spot in the afterlife. Its location facing As-Salih's tomb was meant to demonstrate Khalan's lasting connection to his master and to honor the Salihiyya. While the Salihi Mamluks were typically Kipchak Turks, Khalan diversified Mamluk ranks, purchasing numerous non-Turks, particularly Circassians, forming out of them the Burji regiment. Khalan was the last Salihi sultan, and following his death in 1290, his son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, drew his legitimacy as a Mamluk by emphasizing his lineage from Khalan, thus inaugurating the Khalayuni period of Bahri rule. Like his two Bahri predecessors, Khalil's main priorities were organization of the Sultanate, defeat of the Crusaders and the Mongols, incorporation of Syria into the Mamluk domain and preservation of the import of new Mamluks and weaponry. With regards to the latter policy, Baibars had purchased 4,000 Mamluks, Khalan purchased 6,000 to 7,000, and by the end of Khalil's reign, there was an estimated total of 10,000 Mamluks in the Sultanate. In 1291, Khalil captured Acre, the last major Crusader fortress in Palestine, and thus Mamluk rule extended across the entirety of Syria. Khalil's death in 1293 led to a period of factional struggle, with Khalil's prepubescent brother, An-Nasir Muhammad, being overthrown the following year by a Mongol Mamluk of Khalan, Al-Adil Kitfa, who in turn was succeeded by a Greek Mamluk of Khalan, Husam ad-Din Lajin. In a bid to consolidate his control, Lajin attempted to redistribute Iqta'at to his supporters. Lajin was unable to retain the Sultanate, and Al-Nasir Muhammad was restored to power in 1298, ruling a fractious realm until being toppled a second time by Baibars II, a Circassian Mamluk of Khalan, who was known to be more wealthy, pious and cultured than his immediate predecessors. Early into An-Nasir Muhammad's second reign, the Ilkhanids, whose leader, Mahmud Ghazan, had converted to Islam, invaded Syria and routed a Mamluk army near Homs in the Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar. However, Ghazan withdrew most of his troops from Syria shortly after due to a dearth in fodder for their numerous horses, and the residual Ilkhanid force retreated in 1300 at the approach of the rebuilt Mamluk army. A further Ilkhanid invasion in 1303 was repelled after the Ilkhanid defeat at the Battle of Marj al-Sufar in the plains south of Damascus, third reign of An-Nasir Muhammad. Baibars II ruled for roughly 1 year before An-Nasir Muhammad became sultan again in 1310, this time ruling for over 3 consecutive decades in a period that is often considered by historians of the Mamluk period to be the apex of both the Bahri regime specifically and the Mamluk Sultanate in general. To avoid the experiences of his previous 2 reigns where the Mamluks of Khalan and Khalil held sway and periodically assumed the Sultanate, An-Nasir Muhammad launched efforts to establish a centralized autocracy. Early into his third reign, in 1310, An-Nasir Muhammad imprisoned, exiled or killed any Mamluk emirs that supported those who toppled him in the past, including the Burji Mamluks. He then assigned emirates to over 30 of his own Mamluks. Initially, and Nasir Muhammad left most of his father's Mamluks undisturbed, but in 1311 and 1316, he imprisoned and executed most of them, and again redistributed emirates to his own Mamluks. By 1316, the number of Mamluks was reduced to 2,000. And Nasir Muhammad went further in imposing his rule by intervening to have al-Wathiq succeed Caliph al-Mustakfi, as well as compelling the Qadi to issue legal rulings that advanced his interests. The third reign of Nasir Muhammad also saw a departure from the traditions of succession and administrative elevation of his predecessors, since he observed in his first two reigns that such traditions had been ignored anyway, while sultans were being assassinated and Mamluks were abusing other Mamluks in bids for power. Moreover, Nasir Muhammad's being the son of a Mamluk instead of a Mamluk himself risked undermining his position among the largely Mamluk elite. This partially explains his purges of the thousands of Mamluks purchased by his predecessors. Amid conditions that stemmed the flow of Mamluks from the Mongol-held lands to the Sultanate, Nasir Muhammad resolved to make up for the loss of the purged Mamluks by adopting new methods of training and military and financial advancement that introduced a great level of permissiveness. This permissiveness, which manifested in far more relaxed conditions for new Mamluks, encouraged the pursuit of military careers in Egypt by aspiring Mamluks outside of the country, to the point that parents would sell their children as Mamluks with the belief the children would enjoy an improved standard of living. Under Nasir Muhammad, the Mamluks successfully repelled an Ilkhanate invasion of Syria in 1313 and then concluded a peace treaty with the Ilkhanate in 1322, bringing a long-lasting end to the Mamluk-Mongol wars. Following the détente, Nasir Muhammad was able to usher in a period of stability and prosperity in the Sultanate through the enacting of major political, economic and military reforms that were ultimately intended to ensure his continued rule and consolidate the Qalayunid Bari regime. Concurrent with Nasir Muhammad's reign was the disintegration of the Ilkhanate into several smaller dynastic states and the consequent Mamluk effort to establish diplomatic and commercial relationships with the new political entities. Nasir Muhammad also attempted to assert permanent Mamluk control over the Makurian vassal state, launching an invasion in 1316 and installing a Muslim Nubian king, Abdallah Barshambu. The latter was overthrown by Khans al-Dawla, who Nasir Muhammad temporarily ousted in a 1323-24 expedition. End of the Bari regime. Nasir Muhammad died in 1341 and his rule was followed by a succession of his descendants to the throne in a period marked by political instability. Most of his successors, except for Nasir Hasan and al-Ashraf Shaban, were sultans in name only, with the patrons of the leading Mamluk factions holding actual power. The first of Nasir Muhammad's son to accede to the Sultanate was Abu Bakr, who Nasir Muhammad designated as his successor before his death. However, Nasir Muhammad's senior aide, Qasim, held real power and ultimately imprisoned and executed Abu Bakr and had Nasir Muhammad's infant son, al-Ashraf Kujuk, appointed in his stead. By January 1342, however, Qasim and Kujuk were toppled, and the latter's half-brother, Nasir Ahmad of al-Karak, was declared sultan. Ahmad relocated to al-Karak and left a deputy to rule on his behalf in Cairo. This unorthodox move, together with his seclusive and frivolous behavior and his execution of loyal partisans, ended with Ahmad's deposition and replacement by his half-brother Asali Ismail in June 1342. Ismail ruled until his death in August 1345, and was succeeded by his brother al-Kamil Shaban. The latter was killed in a Mamluk revolt and was succeeded by his brother al-Muzaffar Haji, who was also killed in a Mamluk revolt in late 1347. Following Haji's death, the senior emirs of Nasir Muhammad hastily appointed another of his sons, the 12-year-old Nasir Hasan. Coinciding with Hasan's first term, in 1347–1348, the bubonic plague arrived in Egypt and other plagues followed, causing mass death in the country, which in turn led to major social and economic changes in the region. In 1351, Hasan attempted to assert his executive power and was ousted by the senior emirs, led by Emir Taz, and replaced with his brother, as-Salih. The emirs Sheikhu and Suratmish deposed Salih and restored Hasan in a coup in 1355, after which Hasan gradually purged Taz, Sheikhu and Suratmish and their Mamluks from his administration. Concurrently, Hasan began recruiting and promoting the Awlad-ulnas in the military and administration, a process that lasted for the remainder of the Bari period. This led to resentment from Hasan's own Mamluks, led by Emir Yalbua al-Umari, who killed Hassan in 1361. Yalbua became the regent of Hassan's successor and the young son of the late Sultan Haji, al-Mansur Muhammad. By then, Mamluk solidarity and loyalty to the emirs had dissipated. To restore discipline and unity within the Mamluk state and military, Yalbua applied the rigorous educational methods used for Mamluks during the reigns of Sultans Baibars and Khalan. In 1365, attempts by the Mamluks to annex Armenia, which had since replaced Crusader Acre as the Christian commercial foothold of Asia, were stifled by an invasion of Alexandria by Peter I of Cyprus. The Mamluks concurrently experienced a deterioration of their lucrative position in international trade, and the economy of the Sultanate declined, further weakening the Bahri regime. Meanwhile, the perceived harshness of Yalbua's educational methods and his refusal to rescind his disciplinary reforms led to a Mamluk backlash. Yalbua was subsequently killed by his own Mamluks in an uprising in 1366. The rebellious Mamluks were supported by Sultan al-Ashraf Shaban, who Yalbua installed in 1363. Shaban was able to rule as the real power in the Sultanate until 1377, when he was killed by Mamluk dissidents on his way to Mecca to perform the Hajj. Burji rule. Reign of Barq. Shaban was succeeded by his 7-year-old son al-Mansur Ali, although the oligarchy of the senior emirs held the reins of power. Among the senior emirs who rose to prominence under Ali was Barq, a Circassian Mamluk of Yalbua who was involved in Shaban's assassination, and Baraka, another of Yalbua's Mamluks. Barq was made Atabeg al-Asakir in 1378, giving him command of the Mamluk army, which he used to oust Baraka in 1380. Afterward, he managed to bring to Egypt his father Anas and many of his kinsmen, possibly in an attempt to establish a power base outside of the Mamluk establishment. Ali died in May 1381 and was succeeded by his 9-year-old brother, as Salih Haji. However, power was in the hands of Barq. As Salih Haji's regent, Barq tried to succeed Ali as sultan, but his bid was vetoed by the other senior emirs. Nonetheless, in the following year, Barq toppled as Salih Haji with the backing of Yalbua's Mamluks and assumed the sultanate, adopting the title of Baibars, al-Malik az-Zahir. Barq's succession had been made possible by the support of Yalbua's Mamluks, whose subsequent rise to power also made Barq's position vulnerable. His rule was challenged in Syria in 1389 during a revolt by the Mamluk governor of Malatya, Mintash, and the governor of Aleppo, Yalbua an-Nasiri, who was a former Mamluk of both an-Nasir Hassan and Yalbua al-Umari. The rebels took over Syria and headed for Egypt, prompting Barq to abdicate in favor of as-Salih Haji. The alliance between Yalbua and Nasiri and Mintash soon fell apart, however, and factional fighting ensued in Cairo, ending with Mintash ousting Yalbua. Barq was arrested and exiled to Al-Karak, where he was able to rally support for his return to the throne. In Cairo, Barq's loyalists took over the citadel and arrested as-Salih Haji. This paved the way for Barq's usurpation of the Sultanate once more in February 1390, firmly establishing the Burji regime. Barq solidified his control over the Sultanate in 1393, when his forces killed the major opponent to his rule, Mintash, in Syria. Barq's reign saw the mass recruitment of Circassians into the Mamluk ranks and the restoration of the Mamluk state's authority throughout its realm and the tradition of the early Mamluk sultans, Baibars and Khalan. A major innovation to this system by Barq was the division of Egypt into 3 provinces similar to the administrative divisions in Syria. The new Egyptian Niyabas were Alexandria, Damanhur, and Asyut. Barq instituted this change as a means to better control the Egyptian countryside from the rising strength of the Arab tribes. To that end, Barq dispatched the Berber Hawara tribesmen of the Nile Delta to Upper Egypt to keep the Arab tribes in check. During Barq's reign, in 1387, the Mamluks were able to force the Anatolian entity in Shivas to become a Mamluk vassal state. Towards the end of the 14th century, challengers to the Mamluks emerged in Anatolia, including the Ottoman dynasty, who absorbed the territory of the Karamanids in central Anatolia and installed a vassal as the leader of the Dulkadirids in 1399, and the Turkic allies of Timur, the Akkoyunlu and Karakoyunlu tribes who entered southern and eastern Anatolia in the same time period. Barq entered into a brief engagement with Timur at the Euphrates in 1394, but Timur withdrew during that episode. Crises and restoration of state power. Barq died in 1399 and was succeeded by his 11-year-old son, an-Nasir Faraj, who was in Damascus at the time. In that same year, Timur invaded Syria, sacking Aleppo before proceeding to sack Damascus. The latter had been abandoned by Faraj and his late father's entourage, who left for Cairo. Timur ended his occupation of Syria in 1402 to pursue his war against the Ottomans in Anatolia, who he deemed to be a more dangerous threat to his rule. Faraj was able to hold on to power during this turbulent period, which, in addition to Timur's devastating raids, the rise of Turkic tribes in Jazira and attempts by Barq's emirs to topple Faraj, also saw a famine in Egypt in 1403, a severe plague in 1405 and a Bedouin revolt that virtually ended the Mamluks' hold over Upper Egypt between 1401 and 1413. Thus, Mamluk authority throughout the Sultanate was significantly eroded, while the capital Cairo experienced an economic crisis. Faraj was toppled in 1412 by the Syria-based emirs, Tanim, Jakam, Nuruz and al-Muawiyah Sheikh, who Faraj sent a total of 7 military expeditions against during his reign. The emirs could not usurp the throne themselves, however, and had Caliph al-Musta'in installed. The caliph had the support of the non-Circassian Mamluks and legitimacy with the local population. 6 months later, Sheikh eased al-Musta'in out of power after neutralizing his main rival, Nuruz, and assumed the Sultanate. Sheikh's main goal in office was restoration of the state's authority within the Sultanate, which saw further plagues in 1415 to 1417 and 1420. During his reign, Sheikh re-established the state's fiscal administration to replenish the treasury. To that end, his fiscal administrator led tax collection expeditions that were akin to plundering throughout the Sultanate to compensate for the tax arrears that had accumulated under Faraj's reign. Sheikh also commissioned and led military expeditions against the Mamluks' enemies in Anatolia, reasserting the state's influence in that region. Reign of Barsbay. Before Sheikh died in 1421, he sought to offset the power of the Circassian Mamluks by importing Turkish Mamluks and installing a Turk as Atabeg al-Asakir in 1420 to serve as regent for his infant son Ahmad. However, following his death, a Circassian emir, Tatar, married Sheikh's widow, ousted the Atabeg al-Asakir and assumed power. Tatar died 3 months into his reign and was succeeded by Barsbay, another Circassian emir of Barq, in 1422. Barsbay pursued an economic policy of establishing state monopolies over the lucrative trade with Europe, particularly regarding spices, to the chagrin of the civilian merchants of the Sultanate. Moreover, Barsbay compelled Red Sea traders to offload their goods at the Mamluk-held Hijazi port of Jeddah rather than the Yemeni port of Aden in order to derive the most financial benefit from the Red Sea transit route to Europe. Barsbay also undertook efforts to better protect the caravan routes to the Hejaz from Bedouin raids and the Egyptian Mediterranean coast from Catalan and Genoese piracy. With regards to European pirates, he launched campaigns against Cyprus in 1425 to 1426, during which the island's king was taken captive. Because of his alleged assistance to the pirates, the large ransoms paid to the Mamluks by the Cypriots allowed them to mint new gold coinage for the first time since the 14th century. Barsbay's efforts at monopolization and trade protection were meant to offset the severe financial losses of the Sultanate's agricultural sector due to the frequent recurring plagues that took a heavy toll on the farmers. Barsbay launched military expeditions against the Ak-Koinlu in 1429 and 1433. The first expedition involved the sacking of Edessa and the massacre of its Muslim inhabitants in retaliation for the Ak-Koinlu's raids against the Mamluks' Mesopotamian territories. The second expedition was against the Ak-Koinlu capital of Amid, which ended with the Ak-Koinlu recognizing Mamluk suzerainty. While the Mamluks were able to force the Anatolian beyliks to generally submit to their hegemony in the region, Mamluk authority in Upper Egypt was largely relegated to the emirs of the Hawara tribe. The latter had grown wealthy from their burgeoning trade with Central Africa and achieved a degree of local popularity due to their piety, education and generally benign treatment of the inhabitants. Fall. While the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II was engaged in Europe, a new round of conflict broke out between Egypt and the Safavid dynasty in Persia in 1501. Shah Ismail I sent an embassy to Venice and Syria inviting them to join arms and recover the territory taken from them by the Ottoman Empire. The Mamluk Sultan Khwanza Al-Ghuri was warned by the Ottoman Sultan Selim I that Al-Ghuri was providing the envoys of the Ismail I safe passage through Syria on their way to Venice and harboring refugees. To appease him, Algary placed in confinement the Venetian merchants then in Syria and Egypt, but after a year released them. After the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, Selim I attacked the Dulkadirids, an Egyptian vassal, and sent their chief's head to Algary. Secure now against Ismail I, in 1516 he drew together a great army aiming at conquering Egypt, but to obscure the fact he presented the mobilization of his army as being part of the war against Ismail I. The war started in 1516, which led to the later incorporation of Egypt and its dependencies in the Ottoman Empire, with Mamluk cavalry proving no match for the Ottoman artillery and the Janissaries. On August 24, 1516, at the Battle of Marj Dabak, Algary was killed. Syria passed into Ottoman possession, and the Ottomans were welcomed in many places as deliverance from the Mamluks. The Mamluk Sultanate survived until 1517, when it was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Sultan Selim I captured Cairo on January 20, the center of power transferred then to Constantinople. On January 25, the Mamluk Sultanate collapsed. Although not in the same form as under the Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire retained the Mamluks as an Egyptian ruling class, and the Mamluks and the Burji family succeeded in regaining much of their influence, but remained vassals of the Ottomans. Circassian Mamluks like the Garbiya Kashif and al-Saifi Tarabe started slaughtering Arab Bedouin sheikhs like Shukr and his brother Hassan ibn Mari in 1519 in revenge for the Bedouin betraying the Circassian Mamluks to the Ottomans. They executed another brother of the two in Cairo, and at Nasr Gate they hoisted the heads of the two brothers. The Kali of Kashif killed another Arab Bedouin sheikh, Ali al-Asmar ibn Abul Shawarib. Husam al-Din ibn Baghdad accused the Mamluks of the murders due to their Ottoman sympathies at a council of Arab sheikhs. Although the Mamluk Sultanate was ended by the Ottoman conquest, the Mamluks as a self-perpetuating, largely Turkish-speaking warrior class continued to influence politics under Ottoman rule. Between 1688 and 1755, Mamluk Beys, allied with Bedouin and factions within the Ottoman garrison, deposed no fewer than 34 governors. The Mamluk influence remained a force in Egyptian politics until their abrupt end at the hands of Muhammad Ali in 1811. One Mamluk, al-Alfi, was reported by al-Jabarti to marry Bedouin women many times, sending those back he did not like and keeping those that pleased him. Many Bedouin women mourned his death. Muhammad Ali took advantage of al-Alfi's death to try to assert authority over the Bedouins. Two Ottoman-era Mamluks, Iwaz Bey's Mamluk Yusuf Bey al-Jazir and Jazir Pasha, were known for massacring Bedouins and given the name Butcher for it. After Muhammad Ali defeated the Mamluks and the Bedouin went on a destructive rampage against the Egyptian fellahin peasantry, destroying and looting crops, and massacred 200 townsmen in Belbais and al-Sharqiya province, and also rampaging through al-Qayyubiyya province.